So Willie Wright is a Ford Foundation pre-doctoral fellow and a doctoral student in the Department of Geography at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. His research interests include Black geographies, Black radicalism, counter cartographies, and spatial theories. So please join me in welcoming Willie.
Before I move in further, I need to give thanks and say thanks to Project Grow House and Ryan for even inviting me to think through these ideas with you. So this is some research. Like I said, this idea popped into my head in the summertime, and throughout the last few months or so, I've given more thought to it, but it's still very preliminary. And I also need to give thanks to Odabinga Jones for the title of my talk. I took the title of my talk from the subtitle of their installation that they had at Project Grow House's Round 40. And the title of that installation was Monuments Right Beyond the Site. And I was like, oh, that's dope. I'm gonna make that title of my talk. I'm borrowing tonight. And so the way in which this talk is gonna go, I wanna start by talking about just a couple of literatures that I feel as though are helping to guide me in thinking about urban renewal in Houston and Third Ward. From there, I wanna transition into talking about some of the theoretical frameworks that I'm using to help me think about what I would explain later is like a Black spatial imaginary, and from that I would then start to talk about some of the artists that I've engaged in, like whose work I'm trying to understand from that position. And there are so many artists that I still want to talk to, so there are time constraints, so I'm only going to be able to talk about a few, but there are many more out there that I've been trying to reach and want to reach, and eventually have conversations with. So Robert Bullard, this is a professor at Texas Southern University, and he wrote this book in 1987 called Invisible Houston, The Black Experience in Boom and Bust. But one of the interesting things about Robert Bullard is that he's considered to be the godfather of environmental racism research. So he made his bones in North Carolina doing research on environmental racism, and that's how most people know him. But I came across this book he did looking at development and the economic history of Houston, particularly in these two different decades. So he's looking at 1970s Houston and 1980s Houston. And he's trying to understand in these two different decades, where one, in the 1970s, you had this boomtown era when there was an influx of Black folk coming back south from the north. There are many industries also coming south to the north. One, because in the south we have weaker environmental regulations, and on top of that, the majority of southern states are right-to-work states. So a lot of these industries were leaving places like Detroit to come south so they wouldn't have to wrestle with unions, and that's one of the reasons why Detroit is the city that it is now. So he's looking at 1970s Houston, and he also wants to look at 1980s when there was an economic decline in Houston, and he's wanting to understand how did Black folk and Black communities fare during this time of economic incline and this economic downturn. And basically what he found is that regardless of whether or not the city was doing well economically or not, Black folk and Black communities fared far worse than their white counterparts. And another interesting thing about this book is he kind of foreshadowed the development that we see here happening in Third Ward, and also what we saw happen in Fourth Ward in Freedmanstown. And this book is written in 1987. And regarding the future of Third Ward, he says, the future of Third Ward depends on its residents' quote, resourcefulness and ability to mobilize for action in an effort to preserve their area's integrity as a neighborhood, unquote, against whom he referred to as urban settlers, but who I'm referring to as like new neighbors. And so this book is, is helping me to think about what has been the past of Houston and what will possibly be its future. Also, I'm kind of drawing from this paper that Michelle Christian. The funny thing about Michelle, she was my neighbor. I used to live off of Ben Street on the other side of 288, and this old, beat up apartment complex. It was before Ben's became what it is residentially, And so she lived literally across the street from me, and at the time she was a PhD student in sociology at Texas A&M. Now she's a professor of sociology at the University of Tennessee. And she was doing this paper basically on gentrification right when things were kind of popping off, like right when I was, personally me, when I was starting to see things around '06. And so she was looking at using social movements theory to try to understand how different entities in Third Ward are developing coalitions to address this impending change, which was at the time an impending change. So she was looking at how religious groups, how PRH, Project Row Houses, and political leaders were coming together to try to figure out ways in which to deal with this, what was coming. And so from these two literatures and others, but specifically these two, I'm kind of drawing and thinking about Third Ward, urban development, and how the artists, where I'm seeing myself stepping away from these two. I'm as opposed to being interested in like how religious groups or PRH, I'm interested in how the artists themselves, folk who I refer to as black artists in residence. And I know when that term artist in residence is used, people usually refer to artists who are invited from the outside to come to a particular space and do what they do there. And for me, black artists in residence, as it refers to this project that I'm working on, are those black folk that are born and raised in Third Ward, or those black artists who have made Third Ward their home. So in the process of doing this project, I've been able to interview a few of these artists, you know, and even those who aren't from Third Ward, they've made this community their home. You know, and most of them have lived here for at least 5 years, 5+ years. So I'm interested in how these artists are thinking about development and other ways in which to use space, particularly along this Dowling Street strip, along and around it, because this is considered, this is the kind of like the bastion of Third Ward's cultural. This is where the cultural capital of Third Ward resides, and so I'm interested in how the artists are thinking about what's going on. And what I'm using in which to help me guide and think about this is, I'm a human geographer. When I tell people I do geography, they always ask me, can I do GIS? And I can't. I don't know nothing about GIS other than I don't know how to do it. But in geography, actually, we're split. There are the physical geographers that do the GIS and GPS and all that stuff. And then there are human geographers that actually do work that's similar to sociologists and anthropologists. Only the main difference is that everything we do, we like tack the word space onto it. It's like, oh, you know, the culture of so-and-so in space. And so if you ever want to do geography, you know, just add space to it and you do geography. But there's a subdiscipline of human geographies known as black geographies. And those of us that do black geographies, we think about the alternative ways in which black folk in the African diaspora produce space and relate to space. And Clyde Woods and Catherine McKittrick are two geographers that kind of start to think about this theoretically. And what they argue is that black folk, as the progeny of enslaved Africans and enslaved blacks in the U.S., our histories and our bodies are continually marked by some kind of spatial containment, some kind of spatial segregation, or some kind of spatial marginalization. And as such, we haven't been allowed to access land or space in this traditional, this dominant Western notion, which is tied to land ownership. So as a people who haven't historically been able to own land, and in those cases in which we have owned land, we've been forcibly removed from it, or removed from it via trickery and other means. How do black folk articulate a particular spatial imaginary? How do we relate to space? How do we produce space if we aren't allowed to own land? And what they argue is that black people, we as black people, as in the diaspora, we produce space in these often what they refer to as these invisible and forgettable ways, because they don't exist within the dominant spatial imaginary. And so they argue that black folk, we produce space via imagination, via literature. And it's interesting because Toni Morrison has this book called Playing in the Dark. And in that book she argues that literature, actually by writing and producing text, you are actually opening up space literally within the field of literature. And by doing that, by supplanting yourself within the field of literature, you have the political potential to open up space actually outside in the world, because people get to see the world through your eyes as a black person, as a black writer. So that's one way in which, an alternative way in which black folk produce space that isn't tied to owning land and modifying land. And so that leads me into thinking about, I've been in conversation with one of the artists, and he sent me his, like, what I'm going to loosely refer to his manifesto, describing what he thinks of, describing his art. And he refers to his art as like a dark imaginariance. And what he says about dark imaginariance is, quote, it is a portmanteau that aesthetically and conceptually ties together the social political conditions, multiple experiences, creative practices, and imaginations of black people in America and throughout the diaspora historically, presently, and futuristically. It lies within the spaces and gaps, on the sides, above and beneath the questions and answers. And this is exactly what Clyde Woods and Patrick McKittrick argue black geographies as a theoretical framework and a medical and a method of investigation does. Like, you look for the gaps in those spaces in which black people have to produce things alternatively. But black geographies, in addition to being like a framework and a method, it is a production. Like, black geographies exist around us all the time, so it's both a verb and it's a noun. And so there's this, I think George Lipset, I can't remember, I think he's a historian, but he has this really dope article here, The Racialization of Space and the Spatialization of Race, which simply put, he argues that all races are spatialized and all space is racialized. And he argues that black folk collectively and in general have what he calls a black spatial imaginary. And this ties back into the black geographies. This spatial imaginary comes out of our particular history within this country and throughout the diaspora. And he juxtaposes what he sees as a black spatial imaginary with a white spatial imaginary. And simply put, he says that, you know, black spatial imaginaries in general tend to be more collective, and they focus on the use value of a piece of property. So how can we make use of this property in very fluid ways? Juxtaposing that with a white spatial imaginary, which he says in general tends to be based on exclusivity. So how can I own my own property, and not just own that property, but increase the exchange value of that property? So increase the actual property of the value of that property. So in the future, if I so choose, I can sell that land for more than what I purchased it for. And moving forward, I want to kind of move forward by moving back and acknowledge that black geographies as a concept owes a whole lot to Frantz Fanon. And Frantz Fanon was a psychotherapist that was born in Martinique and trained in Paris, France. And after his training, he ended up in Algeria, right in the midst of the Algerian Revolution. But he goes further than that. He argues that through his observations in Algeria, he argued that the people who he refers to as Resh or natives and settlers occupy two different types of residential spaces, or what he referred to as zones. And regarding what he refers to as the zones of the natives, he states, quote, "The zone where the native lives is not complementary to the zone inhabited by the settlers. The town belonging to the colonized people, or at least the native town, the Negro village, the Medina, the reservation, is a place of ill fame, peopled by men of evil repute. They are born there, it matters little where or how. They die there, it matters not where nor how. It is a world without spaciousness." So here we see, like, Fanon is setting up this argument that Lipschitz builds on and says that, you know, all races are spatialized and all spaces are racialized. But he goes even further and kind of to describe the zone of the settlers, the French settlers that were occupying Algeria. And regarding their zones or their residential spaces, he states, quote, "The settlers' town is strongly built, all made of stone and steel. It is a brightly lit town. The streets are covered with asphalt, and the garbage cans swallow all the leavings, unseen, unknown, and hardly thought about. The settlers' town is a well-fed town, an easy-going town. Its belly is always full of good things. The settlers' town is a town of white people, of foreigners." And so it is through Fanon that Clyde Woods and Patrick McKittrick began to think about what they refer to as a particular black geography. So Fanon lays the foundation for us to think about these alternative spaces in which black folk exist, and also the alternative spaces that we produce. And if I can, I understand that I am here speaking because the Menil has their exhibit on Gandhi. And Gandhi doesn't take a very strong position. Gandhi doesn't have a very strong position in this research project or in this presentation, but I think there are some parallels between Fanon and Gandhi. And I've mentioned that to people before, and then when I mention that, I kind of get a little gas, because people automatically associate Fanon with violence. Because if you've ever read The Wretch of the Earth, the very first chapter is titled Concerning Violence. And what he argues in that chapter, in any situation of colonization, when the colonized react, when the colonized lash out, that lashing out will automatically be violent because their whole condition is violent. They're experiencing violence within the residential structure and within their relationships with settlers. But if you read further, he goes on to argue that violence cannot sustain liberation. Violence cannot produce liberation. And actually, to liberate oneself and one's people, you have to reproduce yourself. You have to reproduce your social relations. You have to reproduce your cultural relations. And if you don't do that, if you rely on violence, then you will continually reproduce the same structure in which, produced you as a colonized subject. And so in that sense, I think he has strong parallels with Gandhi. And although Gandhi didn't speak from an existential position, he more so spoke from a moralist position, he also argued that, if you change yourself morally as an individual, then that can then lead to more changes and more just changes within society. So I kind of wanted to make that touch, because otherwise Gandhi has no place in this, or it doesn't emerge in this project and in this presentation, although I see parallels between the two. And obviously they were both living and acting and thinking during the era of decolonization. Gandhi was trying to get the British out of India, and Fanon was working, with the Algerian Liberation Front to get French settlers out of Algeria. So there are strong ties, actually. So they're geographers that think about how territories produce, and when we think about territory, we always think about it from the scale of nations, how do nations produce territory. But there are folk who argue that actually territories are produced by bodies. So bodies, by challenging a particular national project, or actually conceding to a national project, you're either reproducing that territory, or you're challenging and actually producing another territory. So I'm wanting to actually grasp from that and think about, well, how are bodies within the residential context producing a particular landscape by moving about in that residence? And I'm thinking about white bodies and black bodies. So how is the movement of white and black bodies are within this area, this neighborhood, working to produce a new racial landscape, or a new landscape here in Third Ward. And so I guess I'll transition into talking about the artists. And this is the interesting aspect, because some of the artists are in the room. And I was like, man, I wonder if I'm getting it all wrong. We'll see. Sorry. So the first artist I want to talk about, they aren't in the room, so I think that's okay. Is the collective Robert Hodge and Philip Powell, the second. But the collective is known as Everything Records. And I want to talk about two installations that they did. One is I'm referring to as Nicest, because I don't know how else to refer to it as. I don't know if it has a name, actually, or it's known as just being anonymous. And then their Beauty Box. This quote from Philip talking about these two pieces. And what he said was, quote, "The issue before us is, why did the Menil choose Dupree Park to advertise his exhibition? So this is not to say that neighbors here have no interest in art, but the ad is vague and does little to educate the community on who or what the ad is about." So instead, they post a banner in which they feel as though, with an image of someone they feel resonates more clearly and aptly with the neighborhood. And second, I want to talk about their Beauty Box, which was actually in that space right next to Dupree Park, the concrete space right there. And basically, Robert and Philip took the inside of what could be my grandma or someone else's grandma's house and place it out in the open for everyone to view. And for me, the importance or the interesting thing about this is not so much the fact that, okay, they take what was inside and put it outside, but for me, what's important is they take an image that we have seen on the inside of homes, an image that is actually, in some senses, being erased because of this, the pushing out of existing residents due to the gentrification. So they take this image that we have seen time and time again, but an image that is being erased or removed, and they put that out in the midst of all of the development that is going on around us. So that, for me, is the interesting thing. They're taking something that is being erased, something that is being removed, and putting it out in the fore for all of us to see. Second, I'm going to talk about MF problem. And I have listed here that I might talk about. I was thinking that I was going to talk about the Sunday social and the mobile block parties. And the funny thing about all this, I've not been home for any of this. I only noticed all this stuff via Facebook. And so I would see it on Facebook, and I'm like, oh, that's dope. Like, oh, that's dope. And always wishing that I could be home for some of this, you know. So this is me gleaning things from afar. But I want to talk about the Sunday social. And so the Sunday social stems from, I guess, conversations between Autumn. So Autumn Knight and Robert Pruitt make up this collective MF problem about particular vacant lots in the neighborhood. And so basically what they did in addition, and along with the housing council at Project Row Houses, is they decided to have basically a Sunday picnic with their friends to kind of repurpose this space in the neighborhood. And some of y'all are gonna see yourselves. And so this is like one of the pictures of the Sunday share, kicking it out on this lot with your friends on a nice afternoon. And so I got a chance to talk with Pruitt about some of the work that they were doing, but the quotes that I'm going to pull to talk about this aren't from that conversation. They're actually from an artist talk that he did at the Tamarind Institute in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And I was telling Pruitt when he did that talk, I listened to that talk way too many times, like maybe 5, 6 times. And so the way in which he describes Sunday share, like the conceptualization around producing a Sunday share, is he states, quote, "There's a corner in our neighborhood at Sauer and McGowan that was listed on one of those like 25 worst, most dangerous neighborhoods in America list. And can you imagine seeing like a corner in your neighborhood on that list? And the thing that's weird about it, like when you go to that list and there's the thing that says, if you want to learn more about this neighborhood, click on this link. And you click on that link, and it was a real estate site. You know, so the idea is to label these things as such that it drives down prices. You know, our neighborhood is in the midst of crazy gentrification. So it's just one of those tools to kind of gentrify a neighborhood. And so that listening to that was interesting to me because I came into this thinking about, yes, gentrification involves like the destruction of certain structures and the erection of others, and I was wanting to think about gentrification as also being like the movement of bodies and how bodies give value to spaces. But from reading this, gentrification also includes like those faceless entities, you know, that disvalorize or give valorization to a space. But he goes on further to talk about how they go about producing that Sunday share, and he says like, quote, "But that corner, we decided that corner is not as dangerous as they claim. And it's just a vacant lot on that corner. So we decided to have like a party. We had like a Sunday picnic. We hired out a cook, we had a DJ, and we all just sort of, you know, illegally hung out on that lot for a day." Again, to kind of displace and even just for ourselves to kind of dispel the idea of how this corner can be. Sorry, I didn't even press that one forward. And how it can look another kind of way, you know, with very little effort. And for me, the way in which he's talking about Sunday shared, it is like it explains or it illustrates exactly what like a black spatial imaginary is. So thinking about another way in which to use this vacant lot, that all around us we see that vacant lots have a particular type of economic value. But for him and for Autumn and for those that engaged Sunday share, it had a particular type of use value for themselves, for them as friends, and for the meaning of the neighborhood. And so I also talked to Autumn, but the quotes that I decided to pull from Autumn don't have anything to do with Sunday share. I just thought they actually speak more so to thinking about bodies and the performative aspect of bodies in like residential spaces and what that means. Oh, well, I should actually read this quote first. But regarding Autumn's thought on like, when we were talking, like she had her own kind of view on like what development could be, and you probably read more than I could read right now. But basically, she's saying that it's weird because I would say me and my socialization in really white hippie yuppie culture, I do like coffee shops. I like good coffee. I like vegan food and vegetarian food. I could walk to Urban Outfitters in my neighborhood. But what does that mean when black people don't live, are not allowed to in America, not allowed to live amongst that? And so she's illustrating that black folk in neighborhoods that are being gentrified, whether it's here in Third Ward or whether it's in Durham where I live or whether it's in New York, it's not that we're anti-development. We're anti-development that doesn't take into fact, our particular histories, our culture, and our own particular spatial imaginaries, like what we may dream of for the spaces in our neighborhood. And and another point in that conversation, we got to talking about our own experiences seeing white people in the neighborhood and how that was just like almost like a aha moment. Like, damn, I ain't never seen that, And it might have just been one white person in like the cut. Like, it's one thing I guess to see you see somebody that you aren't used to seeing in your neighborhood, like on Dowling. Like Dowling's a main drag, but when you see them cut down Holman Street and then cut down Lilo, you're like, man, that means something. The fact that they feel safe enough in this particular part of the neighborhood, where in which maybe a year or two ago they wouldn't even drove in that area. That means that there's a shift happening. And
there was a white lady at night running with her shorts on. I said, "Big dog, you need to do something different." She was just going down Cleburne. I said, "Oh, we have arrived."
So she's setting me up for my next quote. Before we came in here. And so me and Autumn were talking about like, yeah, I saw this person here and I saw this person here. And Autumn states that she said, quote, I was just like, when I see that, like when we were talking about, I saw like the white woman walking her dog around Emancipation Park, like at night, like night, like it was dark, there were very little lights, and she was like, quote, when I see that, I'm just thinking I can't go, like living in my neighborhood, living in Third Ward means I don't get to be outside at night, which is what that project was about, like at the block party. So she's referencing the mobile block party that I didn't talk about, but the block party that MF Problem was doing at the mobile gas station here to kind of, display some of the negative or not so savory elements that occupy that space at night with themselves and their friends. So they decided to have a party there at night to again repurpose that space. To think about another way in which that space can be used.